Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I'd always been drawn to isolated places, the kind of emptiness that swallowed sound and left you alone with your thoughts. As a landscape photographer, that solitude wasn't just preferred, it was essential. The best shots never came from crowded overlooks or well-trodden trails. They came from places where human presence was an anomaly, where the land stretched untouched and indifferent to the concerns of civilization. When February ended and I saw that narrow window in early March before the spring tourist season descended upon Utah's canyon country, I knew I had to move quickly. My target was Black Rock Arch near Comb Ridge, a location I'd been studying on maps and satellite images for months. The arch itself wasn't widely known, tucked away in a remote section of the ridge that required both determination and proper planning to reach. I wanted to capture it during that perfect hour when the morning sun would illuminate the sandstone in shades of copper and gold, transforming the ancient formation into something almost otherworldly. To get that shot, I'd need to camp far from any town, far from any other human being. That prospect didn't frighten me. If anything, it called to me with an intensity I couldn't quite explain. I'd spent the better part of 32 years seeking out places like this, and each expedition felt like coming home to a world that made more sense than the one I'd left behind. Comb Ridge itself was a geological wonder, a massive monocline of Navajo sandstone that sliced through southeastern Utah like a prehistoric wall, stretching nearly 80 miles from north to south. The ridge rose dramatically from the surrounding desert floor, its layered cliffs catching the light in ways that changed hour by hour. The Bureau of Land Management maintained several primitive campsites scattered along the rough access roads that wound through the area, each more remote than the last. I'd chosen the furthest site, the one marked on my map with a simple designation, Site 7. According to the ranger I'd spoken with over the phone 2 weeks earlier, it rarely saw visitors outside of peak season. "You'll have the place to yourself," he'd said, and those words had sealed my decision. I turned off Route 163, late on a Thursday afternoon, my Toyota Tacoma immediately protesting as the smooth highway gave way to washboard gravel. The road was barely maintained, meant more for high-clearance vehicles and motorcycles than passenger cars. Loose stones pinged against the undercarriage as I navigated around potholes and drainage gullies carved by flash floods. Junipers dotted the landscape, their twisted forms casting long shadows as the sun dropped toward the horizon. 40 minutes of bone-rattling progress brought me to Site 7. My headlights swept across the empty campsite as I pulled in, illuminating a flat clearing of packed sand surrounded by scattered sage and juniper. The spot sat at the mouth of a dry wash, with Comb Ridge looming maybe 200 yards to the east, its striated face already darkening as the sun abandoned it. I killed the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden silence, feeling the day's tension drain from my shoulders. This was exactly what I'd needed. Complete isolation, nothing but desert and stone and sky. The nearest town, Bluff, was nearly 30 miles back the way I'd come. The nearest person could be anywhere within 100 square miles of empty wilderness. Setting up camp took less than an hour. I'd done it so many times the process had become automatic. Stake out the tent corners, thread the poles, secure the rain fly, even though no clouds threatened. I arranged my camera gear carefully inside my truck's cab, then set up my small camp chair near the fire ring, a circle of blackened stones that previous campers had assembled. As darkness settled in completely, I heated water on my portable stove and prepared a freeze-dried meal. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared, and I pulled on an extra fleece layer while I ate. Above me, the stars emerged in stunning profusion, the Milky Way visible as a bright band across the sky. Out here, away from any light pollution, the universe revealed itself in ways that city dwellers never witnessed. The only sounds were my own movements and, distantly, the high yipping calls of coyotes somewhere out in the darkness. Their vocalizations rose and fell in waves, primitive and haunting. I'd heard coyotes hundreds of times before on other camping trips. Their presence was normal, expected, almost comforting in its familiarity. By 11:30, my eyelids were growing heavy. I'd driven nearly 400 miles that day, and tomorrow would require an early start if I wanted to catch the sunrise at Black Rock Arch. I banked the small fire, made sure my food was secured in the truck to avoid attracting wildlife, and retreated to my tent. The sleeping bag enveloped me in warmth, and I switched off my headlamp, plunging the interior of the tent into absolute blackness. For a few minutes I lay there listening to the silence, then consciousness slipped away. My eyes snapped open in darkness so complete I couldn't tell if I was even awake. Something had pulled me from sleep. Not a dream, not a gradual emergence into consciousness, but a sudden urgent awareness that something was wrong. I lay perfectly motionless, listening with every fiber of my being. My watch face glowed faintly when I pressed the button. 2:08 a.m. Outside the tent, the world was absolutely still. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. Just oppressive, suffocating silence. Then I heard it. Gravel crunching, slow and deliberate. The sound came from somewhere beyond the tent's northern side. Maybe 20 feet away. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Each footfall careful and measured, as if whatever made them was testing the ground before committing its weight. My first thought was wildlife. A deer or perhaps a cow that had wandered away from a nearby ranch. But cattle made more noise, their hooves striking harder against the rocky ground. And deer moved differently, more quickly, more nervously. These footsteps had an unsettling quality. They were too methodical, too deliberate. They circled slowly around the perimeter of my campsite, stopping occasionally, then resuming. I counted the steps in my head, 12 around the north side, then a pause, then 8 more heading west. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I told myself to stay calm. There were logical explanations. Mountain lions sometimes approached campsites, curious about human presence. They moved carefully, testing for threats. That had to be it. But mountain lions didn't wear boots. The thought arrived unbidden, irrational. I pushed it away immediately, but my hands were already unzipping the sleeping bag, reaching for my headlamp. I needed to look, needed to confirm that nothing was actually wrong, that my imagination was simply running wild in the darkness and isolation. I unzipped the tent flap as quietly as possible, holding my breath. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of sage and dry earth. I poked my head out slowly, clicking on the headlamp. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating juniper trunks and scattered stones. Nothing moved. I swept the light around in a slow arc, checking every shadow, every potential hiding place. The campsite looked exactly as I'd left it. My fire ring sat undisturbed. My truck crouched silent and still. My camping chair exactly where I'd positioned it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and foolish in the vastness. "Anyone there?" Silence answered. Not even the coyotes responded. I climbed out of the tent completely, my bare feet finding the cold sand. The temperature had dropped significantly, probably into the 30s. I shivered as I made a complete circle around the campsite, my headlamp beam dancing across the ground searching for tracks. Nothing. The sand and gravel showed no fresh prints, no evidence that anything had disturbed the area. Even my own footprints from earlier, leading from the truck to the tent, looked old and settled. The feeling of being watched pressed against me like physical weight. Every instinct screamed that something was out there in the darkness beyond my small circle of light. Something patient and attentive. But my eyes found nothing to justify that feeling. I returned to the tent after several minutes, zipping the flap securely behind me. My rational mind insisted this was nothing. Just the strange effects of deep isolation on human psychology. The way silence and darkness could conjure threats from nothing. But my hands shook slightly as I settled back into the sleeping bag. I forced my breathing to slow, counted backwards from 100, tried every relaxation technique I knew. Eventually, exhaustion claimed me again, pulling me back into fitful sleep. Morning light filtering through the tent fabric woke me just after 6. My body felt heavy, unrested, as if I'd spent the night fighting rather than sleeping. I groaned and sat up, running my hands through my hair. The memory of the footsteps felt distant now, more like a half-remembered dream than actual experience. In the clear light of morning, the fear seemed ridiculous. Of course there had been a logical explanation. An animal, the wind, the settling of stones, any number of mundane causes that my tired brain had transformed into something sinister. I unzipped the tent and crawled out, straightening up and stretching. The day was already warming, the sun climbing rapidly toward the ridge behind me. Then I looked around the campsite and froze. The firewood was scattered. I'd stacked it neatly last night, creating a tidy pile near the fire ring. Now the pieces lay spread across 15 feet of ground, some thrown clear to the edge of the clearing. They hadn't just fallen. They'd been deliberately tossed. I walked slowly toward the fire ring, my pulse accelerating. Maybe an animal had done this, rooting around for insects or scraps of food, but I'd been careful not to leave any food out, and the scattered pattern looked almost purposeful. Then I noticed the tent flap. It hung open, the zipper pulled halfway down. I'd closed it completely before falling asleep, sealing myself inside. I distinctly remembered the sound of the zipper teeth clicking shut, the sense of security it provided. My stomach tightened. Had I sleepwalked? I'd never done that before, not once in my entire life. But what other explanation made sense? I spent the next hour trying to convince myself that Wynne could have done this, that I'd simply forgotten to zip the tent completely, that my memory was playing tricks. None of it felt true, but I clung to the rationalizations anyway. What else could I do? Pack up and abandon the trip based on some scattered firewood? By 7:30, I'd forced down breakfast and loaded my camera gear into a day pack. I had locations to scout and light to chase. The unsettling morning could be filed away, explained later when my mind was clearer. The hike to Black Rock Arch took me deep into the maze of sandstone formations that characterized this section of Combe Ridge. The trail, if it could be called that, was more of a rough route marked occasionally by cairns built by previous hikers. I navigated by GPS and instinct, climbing over slick rock fins and descending into narrow washes. The land here felt ancient in a way that transcended simple age. Every stone held the memory of vanished oceans, of tectonic forces that had folded and thrust this section of Earth skyward. Wind and water had sculpted the sandstone into fantastic shapes, hoodoos and arches, fins and bridges. It was a landscape that human presence had barely touched. I reached a promising overlook around noon, a ledge that offered sweeping views across the layered sandstone waves below. The light was harsh at this hour, not ideal for photography, but I wanted to scout the angles for tomorrow's sunrise shoot. I spent an hour moving along the ledge, testing different compositions through my viewfinder. Behind the camera, the world made sense. Everything could be reduced to light and shadow, to lines and forms that fit neatly within a frame. It was easier than thinking about last night, easier than acknowledging the growing knot of unease that sat heavy in my chest. Around 2 o'clock, as I was preparing to descend from the ledge, a sharp crack echoed up from the ravine below, the sound of rock striking rock, unmistakable and close. I moved carefully to the edge and looked down. The ravine dropped away steeply, maybe 60 feet to a boulder-choked bottom. Nothing moved down there, but the sound had been clear, recent. A stone dislodged by, what? Heat expansion? An animal? Minutes passed in silence. My neck prickled with renewed awareness, that same feeling of being observed that had plagued me last night. I scanned the canyon walls across from me, looking for movement, for anything out of place. Nothing. I packed up quickly, suddenly eager to return to camp before the sun dropped too low. The descent from the ledge was slower and more treacherous than the climb up had been. I picked my way carefully down the narrow trail, watching my footing on the loose stone. Then I saw it, and my breath caught in my throat. In a patch of sand crossing the trail, clear and unmistakable, was a single boot print. My boot print. I recognized the distinctive zigzag tread pattern immediately, the same as the hiking boots I'd purchased last year, but it was facing the wrong direction. The print pointed up the trail, toward me, as if someone had been walking backward, or as if something had stepped here while facing me, while I was up on the ledge above. I knelt beside it, my hands hovering over the impression without touching. My mind raced through possibilities. Had I passed this way earlier and simply not noticed? But I'd been careful about my route, and I would have remembered stepping here. The sand was too perfect, too undisturbed by other tracks. The print sat alone, isolated, impossible. I looked around frantically, searching for other tracks, for any explanation. The trail was mostly rock here, offering no other readable surface, just this one patch of sand, this one perfect print. Fear crystallized into something sharp and cold in my belly. I stood quickly and started moving again. Faster now, less concerned with careful footing and more concerned with distance. I needed to get back to camp, Back to the truck, back to something familiar and real. By the time I reached camp, twilight had begun to drain color from the landscape. Everything looked gray and flat, the vibrant reds and oranges of the sandstone muted into uniformity. I built a fire quickly, needing the warmth and light, needing the crackling flames to fill the oppressive silence. I tried to eat but had no appetite. The boot print haunted me, that impossible backward-facing impression. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation, but every rational thought felt thin and unconvincing. As full darkness descended, I found myself checking my watch obsessively. 8 p.m., 9 p.m., 10 p.m. Each hour dragged past with agonizing slowness. I fed the fire, watching the flames dance and throw shifting shadows across the surrounding junipers. Every shadow looked wrong, seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. By 11 I was exhausted but wired, my nerves singing with tension. I couldn't stay out here by the fire all night, but the thought of retreating to the tent felt like surrendering, like making myself vulnerable. Finally, at midnight I gave up and crawled into the tent. I left my headlamp on, the beam pointed at the ceiling, casting a dim glow through the interior. I removed my boots and set them just outside the flap, within arm's reach. Then I lay back, every sense straining to hear beyond the tent walls. The hours crawled by. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at the slightest sound, a juniper branch creaking in the breeze, a stone settling somewhere in the darkness, my own heartbeat loud in my ears. At 1:32 a.m., I heard them again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the gravel, approaching from the direction of the dry wash. My entire body went rigid, breath frozen in my lungs. The steps came closer, each one distinct and measured. They circled around the back of the tent, toward the side where my head rested against the ground. Then they stopped. Directly behind me, perhaps 3 feet away, separated only by the thin nylon of the tent wall. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Terror paralyzed every muscle as I waited for whatever came next. Then I heard it. A long, slow exhalation. Human-like but wrong. The breath holding for far too long before ending in a wet, rattling sound deep in someone's throat. It wasn't the breathing of someone who needed air. It was breathing as performance, as mockery. "Hey," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "Who's there?" Silence. But I could feel presence on the other side of the tent wall. Something patient and attentive, listening to my fear. I couldn't take it anymore. I lunged forward and ripped open the tent flap, my headlamp beam cutting into the darkness. Nothing. Empty desert stretched away into blackness beyond my small circle of light. I swept the beam around frantically, checking every direction. Then I looked down and my stomach dropped. One of my boots was gone. The left one, which I'd placed carefully outside the tent alongside its partner. Now only the right boot remained, sitting alone in the dirt, laces still tied exactly as I'd left them. I stared at the empty space where the boot should have been, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. Things didn't just vanish. Boots didn't disappear. There had to be an explanation. But when I searched the area around the tent, my headlamp revealing every stone and depression, I found nothing. No tracks, no drag marks, no evidence that anything had been moved. The boot was simply gone, taken by something that left no trace of its presence. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat in the tent's open doorway, headlamp on, watching the darkness until the first gray hints of dawn began to seep into the eastern sky. Only then did exhaustion begin to overwhelm fear, my eyelids drooping despite my determination to stay alert. When I finally emerged fully from the tent around 7, my body ached with fatigue and my nerves felt raw. The missing boot sat in the forefront of my mind, impossible to rationalize away. I'd have to hike in my old trail runners, thin-soled shoes I kept behind the truck seat for emergencies. Pride and stubbornness kept me from immediately packing up and leaving. I'd come here for specific shots, and I wasn't going to let what? What exactly was happening? I couldn't even name it. Couldn't give shape to the thing that had been stalking my campsite for 2 nights. I forced down instant coffee and an energy bar, then loaded minimal camera gear into my pack. Today I'd push out to Black Rock Arch itself, scout the exact position I wanted for tomorrow's sunrise. Then I'd make a decision about whether to stay another night or abandon the trip. The hike took 2 hours. the trail runners providing inadequate protection against the rough terrain. Small stones pressed painfully through the thin soles, and I had to move more carefully than I would have in proper hiking boots. The irony wasn't lost on me. Whoever or whatever had taken my boot had effectively hobbled me, made me more vulnerable. Black Rock Arch rose before me around 10 a.m., a graceful span of dark sandstone spanning a narrow gap in the ridge. The formation was smaller than the famous arches in the national parks, but its isolation made it special. Standing beneath it, looking up at the ancient stone, I felt a momentary peace. Then that feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. I turned slowly, scanning the surrounding landscape. Canyon walls rose on three sides, their surfaces broken by shadowed alcoves and narrow crevices. 1,000 hiding places for something that didn't want to be seen. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I was completely exposed here, miles from any help, alone in terrain that could swallow a person without trace. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get back to camp and pack up and drive away from this place as fast as the washboard roads would allow. Instead, I forced myself to spend another hour studying the arch, making notes about light angles and compositions. Professional discipline warred with animal fear, and discipline won by the thinnest of margins. By early afternoon, I began the trek back to camp, moving as quickly as the inadequate trail runners would allow. The sun beat down mercilessly, and I stopped twice to drink from my water bottle, always feeling exposed, always feeling watched. I reached camp around 4 p.m., exhausted and dehydrated. The temperature had climbed into the mid-70s, unusually warm for early March. I ducked into the tent to escape the sun, intending to rest for just a few minutes. I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes again the light had changed. Late afternoon now, the sun dropping toward the western horizon. I checked my watch, 5:47 p.m. That's when I heard the engine. I crawled out of the tent quickly, hope surging through me. Another vehicle meant another person, meant I wasn't alone out here. But as the sound grew closer, something felt wrong. The engine note was off, familiar in a way that made no sense. My truck appeared around the bend in the access road, approaching the campsite. But my truck was right there, parked where I'd left it. I looked back and forth between the parked Toyota and the approaching one, my brain stuttering over the impossibility. The moving truck stopped about 50 yards away, its engine idling. Through the dusty windshield I could see a figure behind the wheel, features obscured by glare and distance. Then the driver's door opened and someone stepped out. My legs went weak, because the person walking toward me, wearing dusty jeans and a gray fleece jacket, was me. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to process what my eyes were showing me. The figure moved with strange, jerking movements, limbs swinging at wrong angles, gait mechanical and forced. It wore my missing left boot on its left foot. On the right, my stolen right boot from last night. Both my boots. Both of them on this thing that wore my face. As it came closer, details emerged that made my stomach churn. The face was mine but wrong. Features slightly too sharp, eyes sunken deeper than they should be. Skin texture waxy and artificial. The mouth hung partially open, revealing teeth that looked too white, too perfect. The double stopped 30 feet away, swaying slightly. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, studying me with those hollow eyes. When it blinked, the lids moved too slowly, like mechanical shutters. "What?" My voice came out as a croak. "What are you?" The thing took one step forward. The movement was all wrong, joints bending in ways human joints shouldn't bend. It raised one hand, my hand, and pointed directly at me. That simple gesture broke my paralysis. I turned and ran. I didn't think, didn't plan, just ran blindly into the desert as evening light faded toward dusk. My inadequate trail runners slapped against rock and sand, offering no cushioning, no protection. Within minutes, my feet were screaming in pain, but terror drove me forward. Behind me, I heard nothing. No footsteps, no pursuit, nothing. But that somehow made it worse. I couldn't hear where it was, couldn't tell if it was following or waiting, or simply standing there watching me flee. I ran east, toward Combe Ridge, my only thought to put distance between myself and that thing. Sharp rocks bit into my feet through the thin soles. Branches tore at my exposed arms. I stumbled twice, catching myself before falling completely. momentum carrying me forward. The landscape darkened rapidly. Shadows pooled in the washes and stretched across the ground like grasping fingers. I'd left my headlamp in the tent, left everything behind in my panic. Now the world was reducing to shapes and silhouettes, definition bleeding away with the light. I don't know how long I ran. Time became meaningless, measured only in footfalls and gasping breaths. My lungs burned, my legs trembled, and still I pushed forward. Some primitive part of my brain had taken over, concerned only with distance and survival. Finally, as the last light died completely and stars emerged overhead, I collapsed in the sand at the base of a sandstone formation. I lay there gasping, my vision swimming, body pushed beyond its limits. Gradually, my breathing slowed. My racing heartbeat returned to something approaching normal, and in the silence that followed, I began to hear the desert at night, the rustle of small animals, the distant yip of coyotes, the whisper of wind through stone. Normal sounds, natural sounds, the sounds of a living world that had existed here for millennia before I arrived and would continue long after I was gone. I sat up slowly, taking stock. My feet throbbed with pain, likely lacerated and bleeding inside the thin shoes. My arms bore dozens of scratches from juniper branches, but I was alive, and I was alone. The panic that had driven my flight began to ebb, replaced by a different kind of fear, the practical fear of being lost in the desert at night, miles from camp, without light or water, or any way to navigate. I forced myself to think rationally. The access road had to be south of my current position. If I could reach it, I could follow it either back to camp or out toward the highway. The road was the lifeline, the connection to civilization. I stood on shaky legs and looked around. The stars provided minimal light, just enough to distinguish rock from sky. I picked out the North Star and oriented myself, then began walking slowly south. The going was treacherous in the darkness. Twice I walked into juniper branches I couldn't see. Once I stepped into a shallow depression and nearly twisted my ankle. But I kept moving, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant spending the night exposed and vulnerable. Hours passed. I fell into a rhythm, moving carefully through the darkness, stopping periodically to check the stars and confirm my direction. My feet had gone numb, which was probably a blessing. The pain would return later, but for now I could move without constant agony. Then, impossibly, I saw lights ahead. At first I thought it was a hallucination, my exhausted brain conjuring hope from nothing. But the lights remained steady as I approached, resolving into the headlights of a vehicle parked along the access road. I stumbled toward it, fear and relief warring in my chest. What if it was that thing, waiting for me? What if it had simply driven around and anticipated where I'd emerge? But as I got closer, I heard voices, real, human voices speaking in concerned tones. A man and woman stood beside a silver Ford Explorer, studying something on a handheld GPS unit. "Help," I croaked, my voice barely working. "Please help me." They spun around, the man raising a powerful flashlight that pinned me in its beam. I must have looked like something from a horror movie. Bloody, scratched, wild-eyed, and stumbling. "Holy hell," the man breathed. He was maybe 50, weathered face and gray beard, wearing practical outdoor gear. The woman beside him, younger, reached for a medical kit in their vehicle. "Sir, what happened?" she asked urgently, moving toward me. "Are you injured?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of that question. I need help. Need to get out of here, something." The words tumbled out incoherently as they guided me to sit on the Explorer's bumper. They identified themselves as Thomas and Gail, hikers from Colorado who'd been exploring the area. They'd gotten a late start and were heading back to their hotel in Bluff when they spotted me emerging from the darkness. Thomas handed me a water bottle while Gail examined my feet, which were indeed bloody and torn. "We need to get you to a doctor," she said firmly. I told them everything as Thomas drove carefully along the washboard road, Gail tending to my feet in the back seat, about the footsteps, the stolen boots, the backward-facing print, and finally about the double, the thing that had worn my face and stood swaying in the evening light. They didn't interrupt, didn't tell me I was crazy. Thomas's hands tightened on the wheel, and Gail's face grew increasingly troubled. But they listened. "We need to go to the police," Thomas said finally, "or BLM rangers, whoever has jurisdiction out here." "And my gear," I said, though the thought of returning to that campsite made my skin crawl. Everything's still there. My camera equipment, my wallet, everything. We drove directly to the BLM field office just outside Bluff. It was after 9 p.m., but Thomas convinced a ranger named Glenn to meet us there. Glenn, a Navajo man in his 40s, listened to my story with an expression that grew progressively darker. "You were at Site 7?" he asked when I'd finished. "Yes, the furthest site out." Glenn exchanged a glance with Thomas, then stood abruptly. "We need to go back there. Tonight. If your equipment's still there, we need to secure it." "You believe me?" I asked, surprised. "I didn't say that," Glenn replied carefully. "But you're not the first person to report unusual experiences at that location, and you're clearly injured. Clearly something happened. We need to document it." The drive back out to the campsite felt endless. Glenn led in his official BLM truck, Thomas and Gail following in their Explorer with me. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, dread building with every mile. We arrived just after 11 p.m. Glenn swept the area with powerful spotlights before allowing anyone out of the vehicles. What we found made no sense. The campsite was completely empty. Not just my tent and gear. Everything was gone. The fire ring I'd used was gone. The scattered stones I'd seen that morning disappeared without a trace. Even the ground looked different, undisturbed, as if no one had camped there in years. But there, sitting side by side in the exact center of where my camp had been, were my boots, both of them placed neatly together, laces tied in perfect identical bows. Glenn photographed everything, took measurements, made notes in a weathered notebook. He wouldn't let me approach the boots, treating the scene almost like a crime site. "This isn't natural," Gail whispered, standing close to Thomas. "This is really wrong." We didn't stay long. Glenn collected the boots, sealed them in an evidence bag, and we departed. As we drove away, I looked back once at the empty campsite. In the glow of the taillights, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, tall and still and watching. But when I blinked, it was gone. Back at the BLM office, Glenn made coffee while I gave a formal statement. Thomas and Gail stayed until I'd finished, their presence somehow comforting. "I need to tell you something," Glenn said quietly, when the others had stepped outside. "That area, local people don't go there. There are stories, old stories about things that live in the canyons, things that can wear other shapes, other faces. Skinwalkers," I said, the word feeling heavy on my tongue. "We don't talk about them directly. It's disrespectful, dangerous even. But there have been incidents over the years. Hikers who come back changed. Campers who report seeing themselves in the distance. A few who never come back at all. Why isn't it closed? Why let people camp there?" Glenn sighed. "Because most of the time nothing happens. And we can't close public land based on tribal legends, but we keep track. We note the reports, and we tell people like you afterward, so you understand what you experienced." He paused, studying me carefully. "My advice? Don't come back. Whatever took an interest in you out there, it's not something you want to encourage. It wore your shape, learned your walk. That's attention you don't want." I didn't need the warning. Even the thought of returning to that area made my chest tight with instinctive dread. Thomas and Gail drove me to a hotel in Bluff, helped me check in, made sure I had what I needed. The next morning I drove straight back to Arizona, barely stopping except for gas. My camera equipment was gone, weeks of work lost, but I was alive. Later, safe in my apartment, I found that I couldn't look at any photographs from the trip. The few images stored on my phone from the first day, before things went wrong, filled me with a sick unease. I deleted them all, unable to bear even those innocent shots of desert landscape. Sometimes, late at night, I wake with the certainty that someone is standing outside my window, that if I looked, I'd see myself staring back, swaying slightly, head tilted at that wrong angle. I never look. I stay perfectly still until the feeling passes. And I've never gone back to Comb Ridge. I still backpack, but I pick open ground with clean lines of sight and quick exits. I keep a small headlamp in my pocket even when I'm walking through town. I don't camp under rock lips anymore. Stone sheds water and provides shelter, but it also creates angles you can't see into. Spaces where something can sit beyond the reach of firelight and wait you out with the patience of something that doesn't experience time the way humans do. If you venture into this region and plan to use the trails north of the arch, respect the signs. Don't camp in the rock shelters. If a storm pushes you toward an overhang or a stone lip, remember that rain passes and there are locations where you can ride out weather without putting your back against a stone ceiling and something in the dark. If you hear a voice from the edge of your light, and you see no shadow crossing into the glow, don't hand anything over. If a voice near your camp knows things it shouldn't know, specific gear damage, family private jokes, details that mark you as uniquely you, pack tight and walk toward electric light. Firelight slows some things down, streetlights stop them entirely. That is the only part of this where I feel certain enough to make a claim. People ask me what it was, and I never answer with a label or a name. The word the clerk used exists if you need one. The prints were real. The cap on the bottle was tight. The way two voices came out of a single mouth, specific, distinct, simultaneous, is not something I could have imagined to scare myself into hallucination. Believe what you want. Do what you want in those woods. My advice is simple, and it isn't offered as a dare or a challenge. Open ground is safer. Don't camp in the rock shelters. If you hear your own voice behind your back in the darkness, don't turn. Walk to the light and keep walking. Then go home, clean your gear, and change the parts of your routine that leave more of you out there than you meant to leave behind. I had been planning this backpacking trip for weeks before the autumn weather turned volatile. Late September meant the temperature would cooperate, the crowds would thin, and the trails through the ridge country would still be passable before the winter storms made everything treacherous. My cousin Paul and I had done dozens of trips together over the years. Nothing elaborate, nothing extreme. Just two people who understood how to move through wilderness quietly and respect what the landscape demanded of us. We arrived at the trailhead near Hemlock Lodge at Natural Bridge State Resort Park on a Friday afternoon. The sky already bruising gray at the edges. The parking area was nearly empty. I remember noticing how few cars had ventured out this late in the season, as if the place itself discouraged lingering. We went into the small outfitter shop in town first to grab supplies we'd forgotten. That's where the clerk said it. He was older, maybe mid-60s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades on those ridges. When I asked about the best camping spots along the trail, his hand stopped moving across the counter. He slid a paper map toward me with two fingers, not quite meeting my eyes. "Don't camp in the rock shelters," he said. His tone wasn't conversational. It carried the weight of instruction. The kind of thing said because it needed saying, regardless of how it sounded. I asked why. The answer he gave wasn't really an answer at all. He told me some people talked about something that stayed to the hollows, something that didn't cross into firelight. He delivered this information the way you'd state a rule about tide times or snow load thresholds, factual, neutral, and non-negotiable. He wasn't joking. I watched his face to make sure, and he wasn't. Paul laughed in the car, the way you do when someone tells you something absurd. He said it was local folklore, the kind of ghost story people repeated to make the place feel important. I agreed with him at the time because that was easier than sitting with the alternative. We both preferred to sleep under open sky anyway, we told ourselves. Storms could change plans in rock shelters. We were being practical, not running from anything. The hike-in was uneventful until it wasn't. We followed the marked trail system with its turtle blazes and the numbered posts that marked distance. The sandstone cuts grew deeper as we climbed, the roots slicker where water had worked at them for decades. By mid-afternoon, the humidity had become oppressive, the kind that makes your clothes stick to your skin and your breathing feel labored even on flat ground. Then the wind changed. I felt it first, a pressure shift that made the trees around us move in unison. The clouds didn't gradually thicken. They seemed to collapse downward all at once. Within minutes, what had been a gray afternoon became a thing with teeth. The rain didn't start as drops. It came like someone had turned on a faucet in the sky without a nozzle. The kind of downpour that fills your boots while you're still running for cover. The creek beside the trail swelled visibly, transforming from a gentle flow into something aggressive and churning. The path turned to a slick ribbon, and within seconds I couldn't see more than 10 feet ahead. We were near a shallow sandstone overhang when it became clear we couldn't push forward. The shelter was maybe 12 feet deep, with a stone ceiling that rose about 7 feet at the mouth. The floor was relatively dry, covered with packed sand and small stones. On the back wall, old blackened scorch marks traced patterns where fires had been built decades ago, maybe longer. Someone had left initials carved into the stone. R.H. Manane 87. And I stared at those letters for longer than was rational, wondering what that person thought they were immortalizing. The sign at the junction had been explicit. No shelter camping. But the rain was absolute now, and the wind carried spray that would soak through anything exposed. We made the choice quickly. Paul brought the fire kit while I unpacked the tarp, rigging it so the cooktop would sit protected but centered, visible from both sides of our refuge. The warmth from the small flames pushed back against the wet that was trying to seep into everything we'd brought. We cooked noodles. It should have been routine. I boiled water while Paul organized our sleeping gear, pulling our bags to the deepest part of the shelter where the stone angles up. Our socks hung from a cord strung between two natural stone protrusions, dripping steadily. The heat from our jackets rose up as we sat near the fire, steam lifting off the wet fabric. I checked the map. The plan was simple now. Wait out the storm, eat, try to rest if the noise allowed it, and leave before first light. We were not doing anything special or dangerous. We were just two people taking shelter from weather that had turned hostile. I remember Paul saying something about being glad we'd made this trip before November, when the real cold came. He was trying to normalize the situation, I think. Or I was. One of us was trying to make this seem routine. That's when we heard the steps. The sound didn't announce itself with the typical forest vocabulary. No snapping twigs, no rustling that grew louder as something approached. Instead, there was a steady tread on the wet leaves outside the shelter mouth, deliberate and measured. It moved in a circle pattern, and I realized it was working angles, repositioning itself to see what we had arranged inside our small refuge. The footsteps stopped exactly where the firelight began to thin, at the edge of visibility. Then came silence. Not the peaceful kind that comes after noise fades naturally. This was intentional silence, the kind a person makes when they're holding perfectly still, controlling their breathing, maintaining a position with effort. The back of my neck went rigid with the recognition that something conscious was standing just outside our light, observing. A woman's voice came from the darkness. Clear, normal, the kind of casual tone you'd use asking a neighbor for spare sugar. "Do you have any water?" I did something I'm not proud of, though I'm not sure what else I should have done. I took a water bottle from our supply and slid it toward the edge of the firelight, partially because it felt like the decent thing to do, partially because I needed to see what hands would reach in and claim it. No hands came. No shape stepped forward. The bottle sat at the border between light and darkness for what felt like a minute but was probably only seconds. Then I heard the sound of plastic scraping against the wet sand and grit at the shelter floor. I pulled the bottle back with a sudden jerking motion that Paul reacted to with alarm. The cap was still tight. The scuff mark I'd put into the plastic months ago, back during a solo trip to this exact region, was still there in the same place. The bottle had not been opened. It had not been touched, yet it had clearly moved. Paul met my eyes across the fire, and I saw the moment he realized what I'd already understood. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We let the fire sink down to coals, and without discussion, we both got into our sleeping bags fully clothed, boots still laced tight. The rain continued its steady percussion against the stone lip above us, and I lay in the darkness counting my own breaths, because it was better than listening to whatever was happening just beyond the reach of our dead fire. I waited for the sounds that would indicate departure. A person leaving would create sound, brushing through undergrowth, shifting weight, the rustling of clothing and gear. Normal human movement is impossible to completely silence. None of those sounds came. The forest seemed to hold its attention, as if whatever was outside recognized that we were aware of it now and had adjusted its behavior accordingly. When I couldn't bear the silence anymore, I fed small sticks into the coals until the flames began to edge back into the clearing. The fire needed to be between us and whatever occupied the space beyond our shelter. Paul leaned close, barely moving his mouth, and said something that stopped my heart for the second time that night. He'd seen a face between the trees during one of the flame flares. He described it using careful words, as if precision might somehow make it make sense. He said it looked like someone we both knew from town. Kayla, the girl who'd worked at the outdoor shop and had since moved away. Same eyes, he said, just stretched thin at the jaw. Elongated. I told him he was mixing shadows and stress into faces, that the firelight played tricks. that his mind was building narratives to explain something that had a simple explanation. Even as I said it, I didn't believe it. He didn't either. The voice came back. This time it was closer, maybe only 4 or 5 feet from the shelter mouth. The tone remained friendly, conversational, utterly untouched by the strangeness of the situation. "City boys always bring too much gear," it said. The exact words Paul had used in the car on the drive up. The exact inflection, complete with the way he emphasized the second syllable of always. The same tone that carried a hint of judgment wrapped in camaraderie. Paul sat up sharply. "Who's there?" he called out. His voice cracked on the second word. Leaves shifted in response. Something moved away from the shelter mouth, but not far. Instead of retreating, it seemed to be repositioning. Then the voice began listing our supplies. Not in the way a thief catalogs what they're about to steal, but with the casual familiarity of someone who'd handled each item personally. It said we'd brought the old backpack with the missing brass pin on the left hip belt. It identified the Nalgene water bottle by the melted letters on the rim. Letters that spelled a name I had never shared with anyone. It named my grandfather's knife with such precision that I felt my hands go cold. A knife with a specific wear pattern on the handle. A small dent where the blade met the spine from a cooking accident years ago. A crack in the leather sheath that I'd never had repaired because it felt important to leave evidence of that particular failure intact. I had never posted any of these details. I had never told anyone outside my immediate family about that knife. The weight of its knowledge, spoken casually from the darkness, did something to my nervous system I'm still processing. Fear is one thing. This was something else. A violation so fundamental that my mind struggled to construct a framework for it. A man's voice came next, answering from a different location in the darkness. It used my father's cadence, his rhythms, the way he puts emphasis on the last syllable of my name when he's being stern with me. The voice told me to check the weather twice. My father says this to me every time I trip. My aunt's laugh came after that, tucked into the middle of a sentence telling Paul to save his batteries. Back and forth the voices accumulated, friendly and familiar, voices of people I'd known my entire life, all coming from the darkness just beyond our shelter, layered one over another until they created a chorus that should have been impossible. We pushed damp sticks onto the coals with increasing desperation, trying to force the light outward farther with each addition. The shelter became hotter and more crowded with smoke. In one sudden flare, as the fire caught fresh wood, I saw something that erased any remaining doubt about what we were dealing with. There was a shape low to the ground, just beyond the furthest reach of the light. The detail I caught was enough, and too much at once. I saw hands pressed to the earth, elbows angled high, knees bent outward. It held this position with the precision of an athlete, but there was something deeply wrong about the geometry of it. It looked like a person performing an imitation of an animal, and it had held the position so still and so long that the earth where it touched had begun to collect moisture in the depression. When an ember snapped and flew toward its knuckles, it didn't flinch. Instead, it turned its head too slowly, with movements that suggested joints with a different range of motion than human joints possess, and a mouth opened. The grin that emerged held too many teeth. Not a natural expression, not a yawn. A grin that belonged to something that knew grins could communicate something about intention, and had decided to try the shape on. "Which bag has the fuel?" it asked in Mark's voice. Then, without transition, "Did you pack the orange rainfly?" in my mother's voice. Then, "Don't move," in my own voice, perfect inflection, perfect emphasis, a command that came from my own throat despite my standing frozen with my hands shaking. We moved anyway, because not moving had become impossible. We moved slowly, keeping our headlamp low, trying to maintain some advantage of illumination. The thing stayed just at the edge of the brightest ring of our light, learning the boundary, sliding whenever we slid, matching our movements with a patience that suggested it understood we were eventually going to make a mistake. It didn't rush. I came to understand that rushing wasn't part of its strategy. Pressure does things to people, makes them careless, makes them run in directions that put them in worse situations. It let pressure build like water behind a dam, letting us feel the weight of its presence, letting us understand that it was content to move slowly and deliberately toward whatever outcome it had decided was optimal. We kept the fire on our right shoulder and worked our way toward where the shelter's interior gave way to the trail system. Our gear, we'd already decided without speaking, would stay behind. We took one bag between us, Nothing free-handed, nothing that would slow our movement if we needed to move fast. We reached the trail that led upward toward the stone steps beneath the arch, toward the parking area, toward civilization and streetlights and the ranger station. I don't love hiking at night. The experience of moving through darkness on an unfamiliar path, trusting only to the small circle of light your headlamp creates, triggers something ancient in human consciousness. But that night, ascending wet stone steps with something behind us that moved with deliberate purpose, night hiking became the preferable option. The steps were steep, worn smooth by decades of feet. Water had collected in the crevices where the stone pieces met each other. Our boots slipped continuously despite our attempts to find purchase on the ridges. The climb hurt in the specific way that adrenaline masks initially but promises to make you pay for later. My calves burned. My thighs trembled with each step upward. The shape followed at an even walking pace, tall when it stood upright, dropping to hands and feet to cover ground faster at the switchbacks. Every time our headlamp angled away to check the path ahead, it claimed another half stride of distance. When we stopped briefly at a junction marker to confirm our direction, I heard it exhale, a sound somewhere between a breath and a hiss, from a place that felt too close. It tilted its head as if measuring the precise distance it could maintain while staying just outside the beam of our light. "You forgot your spoon," it said in Paul's voice when he'd accidentally dropped our cheap camping utensil at a switchback 2 turns before. The spoon sat there in the darkness, barely visible if you angled the headlamp just right. We didn't pick it up. Going back was unthinkable, but also something about the way it had spoken the observation suggested it wanted us to look at that spoon, wanted our attention divided, wanted us to understand that it could observe even the details we weren't consciously tracking. At the next switchback, both of our mother's names came out of its mouth simultaneously. Not in the back and forth pattern that had characterized the voices before. Both names, both distinct, occupying the same space from the same mouth at the same moment. It created an acoustic impossibility that my brain couldn't parse. I froze because something in my neural processing threw up a wall. This wasn't fear. It was the raw sensation of encountering something that violated the basic rules of what sound and vocal anatomy should allow. Paul grabbed my sleeve and yanked hard. We kept moving. Stopping would have been surrender. The park's first streetlight appeared ahead like a dull halo on the path. We walked toward it with the kind of purposeful pace that burns energy but doesn't quite become a run. Running invites trips. Running invites falls. Running invites the kind of stumble that puts you at ground level with something moving on hands and feet. The thing tested the streetlight. 1 bare foot. The toes impossibly long and splayed wide. The nails thick and dirt-packed extended into the glow. The foot flexed, the toes curling under, pressing into the light as if testing whether it would hurt. After a moment of measurement, the foot pulled back. It set the other foot down where the light stopped and began to pace there, heel to toe, maintaining its position at the boundary between illumination and shadow. We crossed under the light and I made myself maintain a steady walking pace. Running would break the spell of pretending we were still in control of this situation. The walkway widened as we approached the lodge complex. The single porch light that constantly buzzed with insects was on, and we moved toward it like it was the only real thing left in the world. The shape stayed at the dark edge of the parking lot like something without permission to enter a lit space, rolling its weight from foot to foot. The chorus of voices, all those familiar tones building on each other in the darkness, cut off suddenly, not with a gradual fade, but like someone had flipped a switch. The abruptness of the silence was somehow worse than the voices had been. We stepped into the pool of light beneath the porch and stood there breathing hard. Our bodies pushed to their limit by adrenaline and fear, and the desperate focus of survival. A campground host doing his evening rounds came through the parking lot. He looked toward the tree line when he heard the last rustle, saw nothing in the darkness, and didn't make a joke or ask questions. He walked us directly inside and called a ranger without being asked. We went back at first light with the ranger because asking felt less dangerous than the alternative, because not returning felt like some kind of admission of defeat, because we needed to know if what we'd experienced had left evidence that couldn't be explained as natural. The shelter floor showed drag marks, long parallel grooves in the sand where something had moved with significant weight behind it. The pattern wasn't consistent with deer bedding or a dog's sleeping spot. The marks spoke of elbows and knees pulled through the grit with deliberate force, creating furrows where skin and bone had worked against the earth. Outside the shelter's lip, in the wet leaves and soft ground, the prints were unmistakable. They were bare feet. The toes were extraordinarily long and widely splayed. The dirt was packed so deep under the nails that even the ranger who'd worked this park for 12 years made a low sound of discomfort. Each print was longer than my boot. I measured, and the toes pointed inward at the front, the way of a runner whose feet turn in and who still somehow moves with significant speed. The stride length suggested movement that covered ground quickly, but the direction the prints followed didn't make sense to the eye. The path twisted through the forest in a pattern that seemed to optimize for angles of approach that couldn't be seen from the shelter, and the depth of the prints varied in ways that suggested the thing sometimes traveled on hands and feet and sometimes balanced on legs alone. The ranger measured with a tape, took several photographs, and didn't push into the trees to follow the tracks farther. He said to avoid shelter camping and left it at that. No lessons, no stories, just the facts, left where we could see them, and the implicit understanding that some things weren't meant to be pursued. We checked out before breakfast service started. The woman at the desk asked if we wanted coffee for the road. We declined. The drive home happened in silence. Paul stared out the window the entire time. When I tried to talk about what we'd experienced, he didn't respond, and after 3 attempts I stopped trying. At my house, I cleaned gear like it was a survival task. I wiped the canteen, the old knife, the pots, methodically processing each item with attention that bordered on obsession. I stowed everything in the same places I always did, trying to establish normalcy, trying to convince myself that the world operated according to its usual rules. Then I took my grandfather's knife, put it into a display case I'd never used before, and set that case on the highest shelf I could access in my home. I haven't carried that knife on a trip since. I haven't been able to make myself put it back into a backpack. I went through years of trip reports I'd posted online and methodically removed details. Exact camp locations, specific tree formations, private family jokes that served no purpose except to make my writing feel authentic. You don't help something make notes about you. You don't give it a map of your vulnerabilities published in a space where anyone can read it. Paul sold his bivy bag and replaced it with a larger 2-person tent that sets up quickly in tight spaces. He still hikes, but he won't start after sunset. If he's moving and the sun drops, he stops short and camps high, or he turns back entirely. If he's still navigating when dusk hits, he either doubles his pace to reach a defined campsite before dark, or he accepts that this trip ends at the nearest high point where he can see in all directions. I still backpack, but I pick open ground with clean lines of sight and quick exits. I keep a small headlamp in my pocket even when I'm walking through town. I don't camp under rock lips anymore. Stone sheds water and provides shelter, but it also creates angles you can't see into, spaces where something can sit beyond the reach of firelight and wait you out with the patience of something that doesn't experience time the way humans do. If you venture into this region and plan to use the trails north of the Arch, respect the signs, don't camp in the rock shelters. If a storm pushes you toward an overhang or a stone lip, remember that rain passes, and there are locations where you can ride out weather without putting your back against a stone ceiling and something in the dark. If you hear a voice from the edge of your light, and you see no shadow crossing into the glow, don't hand anything over. If a voice near your camp knows things it shouldn't know, specific gear damage, family private jokes, details that mark you as uniquely you, pack tight and walk toward electric light. Firelight slows some things down. Street lights stop them entirely. That is the only part of this where I feel certain enough to make a claim. People ask me what it was, and I never answer with a label or a name. The word the clerk used exists, if you need one. The prints were real. The cap on the bottle was tight. The way 2 voices came out of a single mouth, specific, distinct, simultaneous, is not something I could have imagined to scare myself into hallucination. Believe what you want. Do what you want in those woods. My advice is simple, and it isn't offered as a dare or a challenge. Open ground is safer. Don't camp in the rock shelters. If you hear your own voice behind your back in the darkness, don't turn. Walk to the light and keep walking. Then go home, clean your gear, and change the parts of your routine that leave more of you out there than you meant to leave behind. The moment I kicked in the trailer door, I saw the girl's wrist chained to the stove, and the man standing over her with the bolt cutters. She mouthed, "Help." He grinned, and my pulse hammered louder than her screams. But let me step back. Let me tell you how I got there. Because the ghosts of that day still walk through my sleep, And sometimes the only way to quiet them is to remember it all from the beginning. My name is Jake Martinez, and this happened to me back in 2017 in Bemidji, Minnesota. I'd been working patrol for 8 years, long enough to know that most calls are routine, and most people are decent. Long enough to let my guard down, just enough to make what happened next feel like stepping off a cliff I didn't know was there. I'd come on shift at noon because Bobby, the day supervisor, had food poisoning. The station smelled like burnt coffee and the particular staleness that clings to places where people work too many hours for too little pay. Dispatch was running skeletal. Just Marla at the board, her arthritis making her wince every time she reached for the radio. Chief Reynolds was in meetings with the county about budget cuts. Again, small-town policing means you wear every hat. Social worker, mediator, traffic cop, detective. Most days I liked the variety. Most days. At 1:30, Marla's voice crackled through my radio. Unit 32, we've got a dropped 911 call. Teenage voice, one word, minds please, then silence. I was parked outside Riverside Elementary, watching kids pour out for recess. Their laughter carried through my windshield, bright and uncomplicated. I keyed the mic. Unit 32, copy. Location. Cell tower ping puts it on Grant Lake Road. Rural route, lots of seasonal cabins. Grant Lake Road. A strip of gravel and jack pines 20 miles out, where the county ends and the wilderness begins. Where people go to disappear, sometimes by choice. Any backup available? Static then. Unit 18 is 30 minutes behind you. Snow's got the main road blocked with logging trucks. And they're waiting for a plow escort. Of course they were. February in Minnesota doesn't forgive mistakes, and I'd be going in alone. I pulled away from the school, watching the children shrink in my rearview mirror until they were just specks of color against the snow. The drive to Grant Lake Road gave me too much time to think. Dropped 911 calls came in two varieties: accidental pocket dials and genuine emergencies where someone got cut off. The single word "please" suggested the latter. But why just one word? Was the caller hiding? Injured? Dead? I'd worked kidnapping cases before, mostly custody disputes that got ugly, or teenagers who'd run off with older boyfriends. But something about this call felt different. Maybe it was the desperation Marla had mentioned hearing in that single syllable. Maybe it was the weather, the way the gray sky pressed down like a lid on a coffin. The road turned from asphalt to gravel 3 miles out from town. Snow began to fall. Not the gentle postcard kind, but the mean driving flakes that stick to your windshield and make you question every decision that brought you to this moment. My cruiser's heater wheezed against the cold seeping through the seals. Grant Lake Road stretched ahead of me like a scar through the forest. The trees closed in on both sides, their bare branches forming a canopy that blocked what little light the afternoon sun provided. I'd driven this route countless times for wellness checks on elderly residents or domestic disturbances that spilled over from town, but today it felt alien, hostile. Every cabin I passed looked abandoned. Snowdrifts pressed against dark windows. No tire tracks in the driveways. The kind of empty that makes you realize how far you are from help, how much can happen in the space between heartbeats. Mile marker 7, 8, 9. At mile 10 I saw it. A tan Chevy van sitting outside lot 62 of the Maple Hollow Trailer Park. The plates were expired. The back doors dented inward as if someone had tried to punch their way out from the inside. The sight sent ice water through my veins. I parked behind the van, noting the way it was positioned, facing out, ready for a quick exit. Professional. The trailer park consisted of 8 run-down single-wides arranged in a rough horseshoe around a gravel lot. Most looked vacant, winter wrapping them in silence. But lot 62 showed signs of recent habitation, footprints in the snow, a faint glow from one window. I approached on foot, my boots crunching through snow that hadn't been disturbed except for a single set of tracks leading from the van to the trailer's front door. Adult male, size 11 or 12 boots, walking with purpose. Not running, not stumbling. Someone who belonged here, or thought he did. The trailer itself was maybe 40 feet long. Aluminum siding stained with rust and winter grime. A small window unit air conditioner hung askew from one side, its cord disappearing through a hole someone had cut in the wall. The front door was plywood painted to look like wood grain, the kind of cheap cosmetic fix that fooled no one. I knocked on the trailer skin, thin aluminum that hummed under my fist like a tuning fork. The sound seemed to echo forever in the stillness. No answer, though the TV inside murmured daytime talk. The kind of shows that filled empty hours with other people's problems. I keyed the mic. Unit 32 on scene. Possible welfare check. Tan van. Expired plates. Trailer appears occupied. Marla's voice came back. Copy 32. Unit 18 still 20 minutes out. 20 minutes. In police work, 20 minutes is eternity. 20 minutes is how long it takes for evidence to disappear, for victims to die, for perpetrators to vanish into the wilderness that surrounded us. I tried the doorknob. Unlocked. This should have been my first warning. Nobody in rural Minnesota leaves their door unlocked in February. Not unless they're expecting someone, or they're not planning to be around long enough to worry about it. But adrenaline was singing in my ears now, drowning out the voice that told me to wait for backup. I drew my service weapon, a Glock 22 that felt heavier than usual in my grip. Training kicked in. Breath control, sight alignment, finger off the trigger until ready to fire. The basics that separate professionals from casualties. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges. And that's when the smell hit me. Metallic and sour, like a butcher's apron left in July sun. Like copper pennies soaked in spoiled milk. The smell of violence, of blood and terror, and things no human being should have to endure. I'd smelled it before at car accidents and crime scenes, but never this concentrated, never this fresh. It was the smell of a predator's den, and I was about to walk into it. The trailer's interior was dark after the gray daylight outside. My eyes adjusted slowly, taking in details. A kitchenette to the right, a narrow hallway leading toward what I assumed was a bedroom. A living area with a television flickering blue light across furniture that had seen better decades. And there, in the kitchenette, I saw her. The girl 14, maybe 15, with dark hair matted to her skull and eyes that had seen too much. Her left wrist was handcuffed to the burner grate of an old electric stove. Her right hand shook so hard the chain rattled against the metal, a sound like bones in a dice cup. She looked up at me with those eyes. Brown, I realized, like my daughter's, and mouthed a single word, help. That's when I became aware of the man. He'd been standing behind the refrigerator, hidden in the shadows, but now he stepped into the light. Heavy shoulders, thick arms, wearing blood-spattered coveralls, and a canvas welding hood pushed up to reveal matted red hair clinging to a sweat-slicked scalp. His eyes were washed-out blue, wide and unblinking, like a fish pulled from deep water. Later, I'd learn his name was Vernon Hicks, laid-off slaughterhouse stunner with a record sealed after a 2009 assault in Duluth. But in that moment, he was just a nightmare in human form, grinning at me with cracked lips and a missing canine tooth. "Step back and show me your hands," I said, leveling my weapon at center mass. His smile widened. He opened his palms slowly, theatrically, like a magician revealing an empty hat. A flensing knife lay on the counter beside the bolt cutters, its blade catching the television's flickering light. "You're early," he said, his voice low but clear, conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. Wasn't finished seasoning her yet. The casual horror of those words hit me like a physical blow. Seasoning. Like she was meat. I moved in 2 steps, angling to keep him away from the girl, trying to maintain a clear line of sight. The trailer was too cramped for proper tactics. Too many corners where violence could hide. "Keys," I said. "Toss 'em to me." He shrugged and flicked something silver in my direction. I caught it reflexively. Too light. Fake keys. The kind you'd get at a hardware store for a quarter. He'd planned for this moment, for interruption. The thought made my stomach turn. I felt the air shift before he moved. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe luck. But I saw his weight transfer to his back foot a split second before he lunged for the knife. I fired once, pure reflex, and the round creased his shoulder. He didn't flinch. The blade whipped past my vest and scored my left bicep, opening a line of fire that made my vision blur. Numb heat spread down my arm, and I knew I was bleeding more than I should be. I fired again. The slide locked on empty. In training, you practice reloads 1,000 times until it becomes muscle memory. But training doesn't account for blood-slicked fingers, or the way terror can make your hands shake. The magazine catch slipped twice before I got it seated. By the time the fresh clip was loaded, Vernon Hicks was diving through the back window, glass raining down like broken stars. The trailer shook with his passage, And then he was gone, leaving only the sound of his boots hitting snow and the girl's quiet sobbing. I wanted to pursue, but Jessica Torres, I'd learn her name later, was my priority. She was 14 years old, missing since Tuesday, her left wrist cuffed to the burner grate with a raw groove worn down to bone, where she'd fought the restraints. I'm not leaving, I told her, digging through Hicks's toolkit for the bolt cutters. They were painted with something dark and flaky, not fresh blood but old, the color of rust or dried mud. How many others had he used them on? I snapped the chain. Jessica could stand, barely, leaning against me as we made our way outside. The cold air hit her like a slap, and she stumbled, but she was alive. She was walking. Deputy Hayes's SUV came fishtailing into the lot just as we cleared the trailer, his face pale behind the windshield. I passed Jessica to him, pointing north toward the tray line where Hicks had disappeared. Suspect's bleeding, won't get far, I said. Hayes's eyes darted to my arm, where blood was soaking through my uniform shirt. We wait for state troopers. He's got an hour's head start if we do. He already took one kid. How many more are in that van? But I didn't wait for permission. The trail was easy to follow. Drops of bright red on birch bark, a left-handed smear on a tree trunk where he'd steadied himself. The woods were dense here, old growth that blocked the sky and muffled sound, perfect cover for someone who didn't want to be found. I followed the blood trail for 10 minutes before the ground leveled into a clearing, and there it was, rising from the snow like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast, the abandoned North Star Mill. I'd heard about it but never seen it up close. Built in the 1940s to process lumber from the surrounding forest, it had been shuttered since the 80s when the industry moved west. Now it stood empty, its corrugated walls gray with age and weather, windows dark as dead eyes. A fresh padlock hung from the side door, but the door itself yawned open. Inside, the smell was even worse than the trailer. Colder, damper, older. The smell of things left to rot in darkness. A bulb swung from a generator somewhere deeper in the building, pulsing sickly light across sawdust that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. But it had been disturbed. Recent footprints led through it, and that trail of blood continued toward the back of the building. I followed it to a corrugated partition that had been erected to create a smaller workspace within the larger structure. The door was plywood on industrial hinges, and it creaked under my boot as I pushed it open. What I saw inside will stay with me until I die. 3 hours earlier, Jessica Torres had given up trying to scream. Her throat was raw from it. And the man Vernon. He'd told her to call him Vernon. Just smiled when she did it anyway, he'd explained, in that calm voice that made everything worse. That nobody could hear her out here. That the trailer park was empty except for them, and the nearest neighbor was 5 miles away through forest that would kill her faster than he would if she tried to run. She'd stopped believing in rescue around the time he'd shown her the bolt cutters. Now she sat chained to the stove, trying to keep her weight off her left wrist where the metal had worn through skin. The handcuff was old, police issue from maybe the 1990s, and Vernon had packed the keyhole with something that looked like putty. He'd planned this, she realized, maybe for months. The trailer reeked of him. Unwashed clothes, stale cigarettes, and something else she couldn't identify, but that made her stomach turn. Vernon himself sat at the small dining table sharpening his knives and watching daytime television like this was perfectly normal, like she was part of the furniture. Sometimes he talked to her. Casual conversation, as if they were friends. "You remind me of my sister," he'd said earlier, running a whetstone along the edge of a filleting knife. "She had your eyes. Dark, like coffee beans. Course she's been dead 15 years now, but I still think about her." Jessica had tried not to respond, but he'd waited with infinite patience until she asked, "What happened to her?" "Car accident. Wasn't my fault, but I always wondered what would have happened if I'd been driving that night instead of her boyfriend. Probably wouldn't have wrapped that Camaro around a telephone pole." The casual way he'd said it, like he was discussing the weather, made her skin crawl. But it was the next part that really scared her. After the funeral, I kept thinking about all the things we never got to do together. All the conversations we never had. Time's funny that way. You think you've got all of it in the world, and then it's gone. He'd looked at her then. Really looked. And Jessica had seen something in his eyes that made her understand she was going to die in this trailer. "But with you, I've got time. all the time in the world to get to know each other. That was when she'd started praying, silently mouthing words her grandmother had taught her in Spanish, because if God was listening, maybe he'd understand better in the language of her childhood. Now, hours later, Vernon was preparing lunch. He moved around the kitchenette with practiced efficiency, opening cans and heating soup on the burner furthest from where she sat. The domesticity of it was somehow worse than the threats. "You hungry?" he asked, stirring the soup with a wooden spoon. "Gotta keep your strength up." Jessica shook her head, though her stomach was cramping with emptiness. She hadn't eaten since Tuesday morning, 3 days ago, when her mother had made her eggs and toast before school. The memory of that normal morning, arguing about homework, complaining about the cold, kissing her mom goodbye, felt like something from another lifetime. "Suit yourself," Vernon said. "But you'll eat eventually. They always do. They always do." How many others had there been? Vernon's phone buzzed on the counter and he glanced at it with the casual interest of someone checking the time. Jessica caught a glimpse of the screen. A weather alert warning of heavy snow. Perfect for him, she realized. Snow would cover tracks, keep people indoors, make rescue even less likely. He was ladling soup into a bowl when the first knock came. 3 sharp raps on the aluminum door, the sound echoing through the trailer like gunshots. Vernon's hand stilled on the ladle, and Jessica felt her heart stop. "Police," a voice called from outside. Male, authoritative, close enough that help was finally, impossibly here. Vernon's face went through a series of expressions. Surprise, calculation, then something that might have been amusement. He set down the ladle and picked up the bolt cutters from where they lay beside the sink. "Now that's interesting," he murmured, testing the weight of the tool in his hands. "Wasn't expecting visitors." Jessica tried to scream, to warn whoever was outside, but Vernon was already moving. He pressed the bolt cutters against her throat, just hard enough to make breathing difficult. "One sound," he whispered, "and I'll cut your windpipe before he gets the door open. You understand me?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. So close. Help was so close, and she couldn't even cry out. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Vernon positioned himself behind the refrigerator, where he'd be hidden when the door opened. The bolt cutters moved to hover over her wrist, right where the chain connected to the handcuff. "Remember," he whispered. One sound. The door handle turned with a metallic click that seemed to echo forever. The police officer who stepped through the doorway was younger than Jessica had expected. Maybe early 30s, with dark hair and the kind of alert eyes that saw everything. His weapon was drawn but pointed low, and she could see him processing the scene, the smell, the layout, the girl chained to the stove. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Jessica mouthed the only word that mattered. "Help." That's when Vernon stepped out of the shadows, smiling like he was greeting an old friend. The officer's weapon came up immediately, centered on Vernon's chest, but Jessica could see the calculations running behind his eyes. Too close quarters, too much risk of hitting her if things went wrong. "Step back and show me your hands," the officer said. Vernon's grin widened, and Jessica knew with terrible certainty that he'd been planning for this moment. Had probably fantasized about it during the long hours of waiting. "You're early," Vernon said, opening his hands to show they were empty. Wasn't finished seasoning her yet. The casual cruelty of it made Jessica sick. Seasoning, like she was something to be prepared for consumption. The officer moved closer, trying to get an angle that would keep Vernon away from her. But the trailer was too small, too cramped. When Vernon tossed the fake keys, Jessica saw the officer's attention split for just a moment. That's when Vernon lunged for the knife on the counter. The first gunshot was impossibly loud in the confined space. A sound that seemed to punch through Jessica's chest and leave her ears ringing. Vernon stumbled but didn't go down. And then he was moving with the knife, faster than someone his size should have been able to move. The second shot came as the knife scored across the officer's arm, opening a line of red through his uniform sleeve. Jessica saw him reload with hands that shook just slightly. But by then Vernon was already diving through the back window. Glass exploded inward, glittering like diamonds in the television's blue light. Vernon hit the snow outside with a thud that shook the trailer's thin walls. And then he was gone, leaving only the sound of his boots crunching through snow and the officer's labored breathing. The silence that followed was almost worse than the violence. Jessica found herself shaking so hard that the handcuff rattled against the stove, a sound like chattering teeth. "I'm not leaving," the officer said, and his voice was steady despite the blood soaking through his sleeve. He was digging through Vernon's toolkit, looking for something to cut the chain. When he found the bolt cutters, Jessica saw him examine them with a cop's trained eye. There was something dark coating the handles, old stains that had dried to the color of rust. How many others had Vernon used them on? The chain snapped with a metallic ping that sounded like freedom. Jessica tried to stand and nearly fell, her legs weak from hours of immobility and terror. The officer caught her arm, his good arm, and helped her toward the door. "Easy," he said. "We're going to take this slow." Outside, the cold air hit her like a physical slap, but it was clean, cold, winter air that didn't reek of violence and madness. Another police car was pulling into the lot, fishtailing slightly on the snow-slicked gravel. The second officer, older, with gray at his temples, took charge of her immediately, wrapping her in a blanket that smelled like coffee and cigarettes. Normal smells. Human smells. "Suspect's bleeding," the first officer was saying, pointing toward the tree line. "Won't get far. We wait for state troopers," the older officer replied. "He's got an hour's head start if we do. He already took one kid. How many more are in that van?" Jessica wanted to tell them about the others Vernon had mentioned, the conversations they never got to finish, but her voice wouldn't work. The trauma was hitting her now that the immediate danger was past, making her shake so hard she could barely hold onto the blanket. She watched the first officer disappear into the trees, following Vernon's trail through snow that was falling harder now. The woods seemed to swallow him, and Jessica found herself praying again, not for herself this time, but for the man who'd risked his life to save hers. Because Vernon was still out there, somewhere in those dark trees, and Jessica knew with terrible certainty that this wasn't over. Deputy Hayes helped her into his cruiser, cranking the heat until her shaking began to subside. Through the windshield, she could see the trailer where she'd spent the worst 3 days of her life. Its windows dark now except for the blue flicker of the television. "What's your name, honey?" Hayes asked gently. "Jessica," she whispered. "Jessica Torres." "Well, Jessica Torres, you're safe now. That's Officer Martinez who went after the bad guy, and he's the best tracker in the county. He'll get him." Jessica nodded, but she couldn't shake the memory of Vernon's smile. The casual way he'd talked about his dead sister. The planning that had gone into every detail of her captivity. Men like that didn't get caught easily. They prepared for every contingency, including this one. The workshop Vernon Hicks had created in the abandoned mill was a monument to methodical madness. I'd seen crime scenes before. Domestic violence calls that ended in blood. Car accidents that painted the highway red. Even a murder-suicide from my rookie year that still visited my dreams. But this was different. This was industrial-scale horror, organized and efficient as a slaughterhouse floor. A metal workbench dominated the center of the space, its surface scarred with knife marks and stained dark with substances I didn't want to identify. Above it, a rack of tools hung with surgical precision, flensing knives, bone saws, devices I couldn't name but whose purpose was sickeningly clear. The smell here was worse than in the trailer, death concentrated and aged like walking into a tomb. Vernon stood at the far end of the bench, one hand pressing gauze to his wounded shoulder, the other tattooing something onto a strip of what looked like leather with a soldering iron. Except it wasn't leather, I realized with growing horror. The flesh was too pale, too thin. Human skin, stretched and pinned to a wooden frame like vellum. I saw then that what I'd mistaken for gauze was actually a child's t-shirt, pink with cartoon unicorns now stained dark with blood, and the skin on the table wasn't his. Rage flared so hot it felt clean, burning away fear and replacing it with crystalline focus. This monster had been hunting children, processing them like livestock, turning them into trophies. "Police, don't move!" Vernon glanced over his shoulder with that same casual smile, as if I'd interrupted him reading the newspaper rather than mutilating a child's corpse. He kept the soldering iron on the flesh, letters burning black and smoking. "Keep," he said conversationally, and I could see the word branded into the skin. "The rest spells quiet. Takes 2 passes to get it deep enough." My second bullet hit the workbench beside him, sending sparks flying from the iron's cord. Vernon hurled a gallon jug in response. Ammonia, from the smell, fanning through the air in an acrid cloud that made my eyes water and my throat close. He rushed me while I was blinded, swinging the soldering iron like a mace. I blocked with my pistol frame, feeling the heat kiss my cheek as the iron's tip grazed my skin. The pain was immediate and searing, but muscle memory kept my trigger finger under control. 3 shots. Center mass. The .40 caliber rounds hit Vernon Hicks like sledgehammer blows, spinning him around and sending him crashing against the workbench. He toppled into a coil of extension cord, his life leaking out onto sawdust that had absorbed too much blood already. Silence settled over the mill except for the generator's distant hum. Then I heard it, a soft rustle from behind stacked lumber near the back wall. "Show your hands," I called, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Come forward slowly." A boy crawled into view, maybe 8 years old, duct tape around his ankles, blonde hair, blue eyes wide with terror that had aged him decades in however long he'd been here. Behind him, partially hidden by a fallen beam, I could see another child, this one unconscious but breathing. I cut them loose with Vernon's own knife, the irony not lost on me. The conscious boy, Tommy, he whispered when I asked his name, clung to me as I carried him outside. The other child, a girl no more than 10, I cradled in my arms like she was made of glass. The snow was falling harder now, fat flakes that would soon cover the mill and everything in it. But not before the state crime scene unit could process it, could catalog every piece of evidence that would tell the story of Vernon Hicks's systematic horror. Deputy Hayes was waiting with EMTs who immediately took charge of the children. Their professionalism was a comfort. Gentle hands, warm blankets, soft voices that promised safety. But I could see in their eyes the same sick knowledge that was growing in mine. If Vernon had taken these 2 recently, how many others had there been over the years? More police arrived as word spread. State troopers, county detectives, the FBI field office from Duluth. The mill became a hive of controlled activity, each investigator adding another piece to a puzzle that grew more horrific with each revelation. They found 6 sets of remains in shallow pits behind the mill, all missing children from towns too small to make national news. Vernon Hicks had been working 3 counties for 10 years, moving whenever the heat got too intense, always finding new hunting grounds among communities that trusted their neighbors and left their doors unlocked. The coroner, a thin man named Patterson who'd worked these woods for 30 years, emerged from the mill looking like he'd aged a decade in an hour. "Worst I've ever seen," he told Chief Reynolds, not knowing I was close enough to hear. "What that man did to those children. There's evil in this world that normal people can't comprehend." I understood what he meant. Standing in that workshop, seeing the methodical tools and the trophies Vernon had made from his victims, I'd glimpsed something that existed beyond normal human malice. This wasn't passion or rage or even madness in any clinical sense. It was something colder, more calculating. The kind of evil that plans ahead, that improvises, that learns from its mistakes. The kind that would have kept killing indefinitely, if not for a teenager's desperate 911 call, and a chain of coincidences that put me in the right place at the right time. But even as I told myself we'd won, that Vernon Hicks would never hurt another child, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd only seen the surface. The mill was too well equipped, too organized for a man working alone. The timing of everything, his preparation for police intervention, the backup locations, the escape routes, suggested someone who'd had help, or at least training. Special Agent Morrison from the FBI arrived just as the coroner's team was loading the last of the remains. She was a compact woman with silver hair and the kind of eyes that had seen too much but kept looking anyway. "Officer Martinez," she said, finding me sitting on the bumper of an ambulance while a paramedic rebandaged my arm. "I need to ask you some questions about the suspect." I told her everything I could remember about Vernon, his calm demeanor, his planning, the way he'd talked about seasoning Jessica like it was a cooking technique. Morrison took notes in a leather portfolio, occasionally asking for clarification on details that seemed insignificant to me, but clearly meant something to her. "The branding on the skin," she said finally. "You're sure it spelled keep quiet?" First word was definitely keep. He said the rest would spell quiet, but I stopped him before he could finish. Morrison nodded, but something in her expression suggested this detail was more important than I realized. She excused herself and walked toward the mill, talking rapidly into her phone. The crime scene photographer emerged an hour later, his face pale behind his camera gear. I'd worked with him before, a veteran who documented everything from gang shootings to domestic homicides without flinching. Seeing him shaken was more unsettling than the gore itself. "How many photos?" Detective Williams asked him. 400 and change. Every angle, every tool, every... He paused, looking for words that wouldn't sound clinical. Every trophy. This guy was documenting his work, keeping records. Records. The word hit me like ice water. If Vernon had been keeping records, that meant there were files somewhere. Documentation of victims we hadn't found yet. Families who still didn't know what had happened to their children. As if reading my thoughts, Agent Morrison reappeared at my side. "Officer Martinez, I need to ask you about the suspect's demeanor when you encountered him. You said he seemed prepared for police intervention. More than prepared. He had fake keys ready to throw. The trailer was set up for a quick escape. Van facing out, back window rigged to break easily. He'd thought through every angle. And his speech patterns? Any specific phrases or terminology that stood out?" I thought back to those terrible moments in the trailer workshop. Seasoning. He talked about seasoning Jessica like she was meat, and he mentioned time, said he had all the time in the world to get to know her. Morrison's pen stopped moving. Time. That's interesting. Did he say anything else about time? About schedules or deadlines? He said, I was early, that he wasn't finished with her yet. She closed her portfolio and looked toward the mill, where crime scene techs were still working under portable lights. The snow was coming down so hard now that their figures looked like ghosts moving through the beam. "Officer Martinez, what I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this conversation. We've been tracking a network of individuals who share certain interests regarding children. They communicate through encrypted channels, trade information, sometimes coordinate activities. The phrase 'keep quiet' has shown up in several cases across the Midwest. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Vernon Schwan Hooks wasn't just a lone predator. He was part of something larger, more organized, something that might still be operating. You think there are others? I think Vernon Hicks was very careful, very methodical, and very connected. Men like that don't work in complete isolation. They find each other, they share techniques, they learn from each other's mistakes. She handed me her card, the FBI logo stark against white cardstock. If you remember anything else, anything at all, call me immediately. And Officer Martinez, watch your back. Networks like this don't forget when someone disrupts their operations. As she walked away, I looked around at the scene. Police cars with their light bars painting the snow red and blue. Crime scene tape fluttering in the wind. The mill itself squatting in the darkness like a malevolent beast. We'd stopped Vernon Hicks, saved 2 children, found the remains of 6 others who could finally be laid to rest. But somewhere out there, in other abandoned buildings, in other forgotten places, the network continued. Other monsters were making their plans, learning from Vernon's mistakes, adapting to new realities. The quiet that Vernon had tried to brand onto his victim's skin wasn't just about silencing screams. It was about the silence that enables evil, the quiet of small towns that don't ask hard questions, of systems that don't share information, of good people who assume the worst could never happen in their community. As I climbed into my cruiser to head back to town, I realized that Vernon Hicks had taught me something about the nature of evil. It's patient, it's organized, and it relies on the rest of us staying quiet. But some ghosts, once awakened, refused to be silenced. The Bemidji Police Department became a different place in the days following the mill. Reporters camped outside, their cameras hungry for details we couldn't share. FBI agents moved through our hallways like efficient ghosts, setting up equipment and conducting interviews that lasted hours. The quiet routine of small-town policing was replaced by the controlled chaos of a federal investigation. I spent 3 days being debriefed, telling the same story over and over to different agents who approached it from different angles. They wanted every detail, the exact words Vernon had used, the layout of both crime scenes, the condition of the children when I found them. I gave them everything I could remember, but even as I talked, I could feel pieces of the memory slipping away, my mind trying to protect itself from images it wasn't meant to process. Agent Morrison remained the lead investigator, and I learned that her interest in the case went beyond the immediate crimes. She showed me photographs from other scenes in Wisconsin, Iowa, Nebraska. Abandoned buildings turned into workshops, tools arranged with the same methodical precision. That same phrase burned into skin or carved into wood. Keep quiet. 15 confirmed cases across 7 states, she told me on Thursday afternoon, spreading files across the conference table in what used to be our break room, all fitting the same pattern. Isolated locations, methodical preparation, children taken from small communities where disappearances might not immediately trigger major investigations. The photographs were clinical, sanitized for law enforcement consumption, but they still made my stomach turn. Each scene told the same story: careful planning, systematic violence, and attention to detail that spoke of practice and refinement. You think they're all connected? I asked. We know they are. We've been monitoring communications between individuals with these specific interests for 2 years. They call themselves collectors. They share techniques, trade information about potential targets, even coordinate timing to avoid detection patterns. She pulled out a thick file marked with classifications I didn't recognize. Vernon Hicks was more than just a participant. Based on what we found in his van and at his apartment in Duluth, he was a teacher. He documented his methods, shared them with others, helped them improve their operations. The van had yielded a laptop with encrypted files that the FBI's cyber crimes unit was still working to crack. But they'd found enough unencrypted material to paint a picture of systematic predation that made my blood run cold. Maps marked with potential hunting grounds, profiles of children from broken homes or single-parent families, detailed notes on law enforcement response times in rural communities. Vernon Hicks had turned child abduction into a science. How many others are out there? I asked. Morrison's expression was grim. We've identified at least 12 active participants in the network. Most are like Hicks, working alone but sharing information. But there are indications of a more centralized structure, someone coordinating activities and providing resources. She showed me intercepted communications, coded messages that looked like harmless conversations about hobbies or interests but carried deeper meanings. The FBI had been working to crack the code for months, building profiles and tracking movements, but the network was careful, paranoid, always evolving. Your intervention here may have disrupted more than just Hicks's operation, Morrison continued. These people are smart, and they learn from each other's mistakes. The fact that Hicks was caught in the act, that his methods were exposed, will force them to adapt. That could work in our favor, make them nervous, cause them to make mistakes, or it could drive them deeper underground. The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders like lead. I'd been trying to save one girl, following basic police procedure for a welfare check. The idea that my actions might have broader implications for a national investigation was overwhelming. What happens now? Now we use what we learned here to build a bigger case. Hicks's files, his communications, the physical evidence from both scenes. It all goes into a database that helps us map the network and predict where they might strike next. She closed the files and looked at me directly. But I meant what I said before, Officer Martinez. These people don't forget. They know someone in Bemidji disrupted their operations, and they know law enforcement is closing in. They might decide to eliminate the threat. The threat, meaning me, and anyone else who could testify about what we'd found, including Jessica Torres, who was still in protective custody at the hospital, and the 2 children we'd rescued from the mill. That night I drove by Jessica's house for the 3rd time since the incident. Her mother had posted a guard rotation of family members and neighbors. Good people who understood that the nightmare wasn't necessarily over just because Vernon Hicks was dead. They watched my patrol car with eyes that held equal measures of gratitude and lingering fear. The Torres family had been through enough. Elena Torres, Jessica's mother, worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat after her husband's death in Afghanistan. Jessica was their hope for the future. Honor roll student, college-bound, the kind of kid who made teachers believe in what they were doing. Now she sat in a hospital room, talking to psychiatrists about trauma that would take years to process. I'd visited her once, bringing flowers that seemed pathetically inadequate given what she'd survived. She'd been polite but distant, her eyes constantly moving to the door, the windows, anywhere a threat might emerge. The girl who'd mouthed help in that trailer was still there, but she was wrapped in layers of protective numbness that might never fully heal. She asks about you, Elena had told me in the hallway afterward. Wants to know if you caught all of them. All of them. As if she instinctively understood what the FBI was just beginning to grasp. That Vernon Hicks was part of something larger, more dangerous than a single madman with a taste for violence. Tell her we're working on it, I'd said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. On Friday, Chief Reynolds called me into his office. He looked older than he had a week ago, the stress of managing a federal investigation and media circus adding years to his face. "How are you holding up, Jake?" "I'm fine, Chief." The standard answer, though we both knew it was bullshit. I hadn't slept more than 3 hours straight since the mill, and those hours were filled with dreams of children's voices calling for help from places I couldn't find. FBI wants to keep you on as a consultant for the broader investigation. They think your experience with Hicks could be valuable as they track down the others. The offer wasn't unexpected, but it still made me pause. Taking it would mean diving deeper into a world I'd only glimpsed, spending months or years tracking predators through their underground networks. It would mean more crime scenes, more victims, more exposure to evil that most people never knew existed. But it would also mean justice for children who might not get it otherwise. "What do you think, Chief?" Reynolds leaned back in his chair, studying me with the same careful attention he gave budget reports and personnel decisions. "I think you've got a choice to make. You can go back to regular patrol, work traffic stops and domestic calls, try to forget what you saw in that mill, or you can follow this through to the end, help put these bastards away for good." He paused, then added, "Either choice is right, Jake. You've already done more than your duty. No one would blame you for walking away." But walking away meant leaving Jessica Torres and thousands of other potential victims in the hands of monsters who were learning from Vernon Hicks's mistakes. It meant going back to patrol, knowing that somewhere out there, in abandoned mills and rural workshops, the network was adapting, evolving, finding new ways to hunt children. I thought about the phrase burned into that child's skin. Keep quiet. About the silence that enables evil to flourish. About the responsibility that comes with seeing the truth, even when that truth is unbearable. "I'll take the assignment," I said. Reynolds nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. "FBI wants you in Minneapolis Monday morning. Agent Morrison will brief you on the broader operation." As I left his office, I realized that my life in small-town Minnesota was effectively over. The quiet routine of rural policing, the comfortable predictability of a community where everyone knew everyone else. Vernon Hicks had stolen that from me as surely as he'd stolen innocence from his victims. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the quiet we'd all been living in was an illusion. A comfortable fiction that allowed evil to operate in the spaces between our awareness. Maybe it was time to make some noise. That evening, I sat in my cruiser outside the mill one last time. The crime scene tape was gone. The investigators finished with their work, but the building itself remained empty, waiting for demolition orders that would probably never come. In a few months, it would just be another abandoned structure in the Minnesota woods, its secrets buried with its victims. But the network Vernon Hicks had been part of was still out there, in other mills, other workshops, other communities that thought they were safe. And somewhere, another child was being prepared for horrors I could barely imagine. The ghosts that had awakened in this place weren't the kind that could be laid to rest with bullets and handcuffs. They demanded something more, the kind of justice that comes only from exposing every secret, pursuing every lead, refusing to let the quiet settle again until every predator was caged. As I drove back toward town, I made a promise to the darkness behind me and the children who died in it. The network thought they could stay hidden, that law enforcement would never understand their methods or predict their movements. They were about to learn how wrong they were. 6 months after Vernon Hicks died on the floor of the North Star Mill, I sat in a sterile conference room in Minneapolis, staring at a wall covered in photographs that told the story of the most extensive child trafficking network in American history. The faces looked back at me, some alive, some recovered, too many that we'd found too late. Each photograph represented a family destroyed, a community scarred, a failure of systems that were supposed to protect the innocent. But they also represented progress, pieces of a puzzle that we'd finally learned to solve. 18 arrests across 9 states, Agent Morrison was saying, her voice cutting through my exhaustion. 4 major workshops shut down, 12 children recovered alive. The network that Vernon Hicks helped build is finished. The operation had taken everything I had and more. 6 months of following leads through dark places, of learning to think like predators in order to catch them, of seeing humanity's capacity for evil displayed in methodical detail. I'd aged years in those months, felt something inside me harden and calcify until I wasn't sure I remembered how to feel normal human emotions. But we'd done it. The FBI's task force, working with local law enforcement across the Midwest, had systematically dismantled the network that called itself The Collection. We'd tracked their communications, infiltrated their forums, turned their own paranoia against them, until the whole structure collapsed. The man at the center of it all, the one Morrison had called the coordinator, turned out to be a retired elementary school principal from Des Moines named Robert Chen. 63 years old, grandfather of 4, pillar of his community. For 8 years, he'd been organizing the systematic abduction, abuse, and murder of children across 7 states, providing resources and coordination to predators like Vernon Hicks. His arrest had been almost anticlimactic. No dramatic chase, no final confrontation. Just FBI agents at his door on a Tuesday morning, presenting a warrant while his wife watered her garden and asked what was wrong. She still didn't know, might never understand how the man she'd been married to for 40 years had been living a double life that turned children into commodities. "What's the final count?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Morrison consulted her files. 47 confirmed victims, dating back 12 years. Probably more that we'll never be able to prove. The network was careful about documentation. They kept records for operational purposes but destroyed them regularly to avoid leaving evidence. 47 children. Each one represented a family like the Torres family. Parents who'd gone to sleep one night with their children safe in their beds and woken to every parent's worst nightmare. Some of those families had answers now. Closure of a sort. Others would carry their questions forever. And the survivors? 19 recovered alive, including Jessica Torres and the 2 you pulled from the mill. They're getting the best treatment available, but Morrison's voice trailed off, and I understood. Some wounds heal, others just learn to live with the scars. I'd visited Jessica 3 times during the investigation, watching her slowly emerge from the protective shell trauma had built around her. She was back in school now, excelling as she always had. But there were differences. She sat with her back to the wall. She avoided crowds. She slept with a light on and probably always would. But she was alive, and she was fighting, and sometimes that's all the victory you get. "What happens to you now?" Morrison asked. "Chief Reynolds made it clear you've got a job in Bemidji as long as you want it." I considered the question. For 6 months, I'd been living out of hotel rooms and rental cars, chasing monsters through the dark corners of America. The work had been necessary, vital even, but it had cost me something I wasn't sure I could get back. The ability to see a van parked outside a school and not immediately wonder what was inside. The capacity to trust that most people were fundamentally decent. "I think I need to go home," I said finally. Morrison nodded as if she'd expected that answer. "The offer stands if you change your mind. We could use someone with your instincts in the behavioral analysis unit." But I was tired of analyzing behavior, of thinking like predators, of seeing the world through the lens of worst-case scenarios. I wanted to go back to small-town policing, to traffic stops and domestic calls and Friday night football games. I wanted to remember what it felt like to live in a community instead of just surviving in one. The drive back to Bemidji took me past the mill for the first time since that snowy February night. The building was gone, reduced to a concrete foundation and a pile of twisted metal that would be hauled away once the paperwork cleared. Someone had planted wildflowers around the perimeter. Black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers that would bloom every summer as a small memorial to the children who'd died there. It was better this way. The building itself had been contaminated by what happened inside it, transformed from mere architecture into something that would have haunted the landscape forever. Better to let the forest reclaim it, let new growth cover the scars. But the memories would remain. In the files the FBI would keep forever. In the nightmares of the survivors. In the questions that families would carry until they died. Some ghosts can't be laid to rest with demolition and wildflowers. I'd learned something during those 6 months of hunting monsters. Evil isn't an aberration. It's not some rare occurrence that strikes randomly and then disappears. It's patient and persistent and always looking for opportunities. It organizes itself, learns from its mistakes, adapts to new realities. The only thing that stops it is people willing to look into the darkness and refuse to turn away. That evening, I sat in my police cruiser outside Jessica's house, part of the informal protection detail that had become routine for our department. The Torres family had moved on with their lives as much as anyone could. but they understood that safety was an illusion that had to be actively maintained. Elena Torres came out to talk, bringing coffee that tasted like forgiveness. "How is she?" I asked. "Better. Still has bad days, but she's planning for college now. Wants to study criminal justice." Elena smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Says she wants to help catch the bad guys." Another generation drawn into the fight between light and darkness. Jessica Torres, who should have been worried about homework and boyfriends and prom dresses, would instead spend her life studying the minds of predators. The network had stolen her childhood, but it had also given her purpose. "She asks about you," Elena continued. "Wants to know if all the bad guys are really gone." I considered the question. The network we'd tracked was finished. Its members dead or imprisoned. But networks could be rebuilt. New organizations could form. Other predators could learn from the mistakes we'd exposed. Evil was a renewable resource, constantly finding new forms and new opportunities. "Tell her we got them all," I said, because sometimes hope is more important than absolute truth. "Tell her she's safe now." Elena nodded and went back inside, leaving me alone with the quiet that had settled over Bemidji like snow. It was a different quiet now than the one Vernon Hicks had tried to enforce with violence and fear. This was the quiet of a community that had learned to watch out for itself, that understood the price of complacency. As I prepared to end my shift, dispatch crackled through the radio. "Unit 32, we have a welfare check. Elderly resident. Hasn't been seen for 2 days." Normal police work. The kind of call that usually meant someone had fallen and couldn't get up, or had simply forgotten to check in with worried relatives. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would make headlines or require federal intervention. "Unit 32, copy. En route." I started the engine and pulled away from the Torres house, leaving behind the ghosts of the mill and the monsters we'd tracked across 9 states. Tomorrow there would be new calls, new problems, new opportunities to serve and protect a community that had learned to trust again. But tonight, as I drove through streets where porch lights burned against the darkness and families slept safely behind locked doors, I carried with me the knowledge that silence isn't always golden. Sometimes it's complicit. Sometimes it's deadly. The network was broken. Its members scattered or caged. But somewhere out there, in other small towns with other abandoned buildings, new predators were learning that the quiet we'd once taken for granted was an illusion that good people could no longer afford. The ghosts Vernon Hicks had awakened would never fully rest. They would whisper in the spaces between what we know and what we fear, reminding us that the price of peace is eternal vigilance. And sometimes, when the wind blows through empty mills and forgotten places, you can still hear their voices calling across the darkness. "Help!" But now, finally, we're listening. My name is Frank Bennett, and I'm 65 years old. This is the story of something that happened to me in the summer of 2022. An experience that changed my life forever. I've been a park ranger in the vast Ozark National Forest in Arkansas for over 3 decades. It's a job that keeps me connected to nature, far from the bustling city life which suits me just fine. My days were usually filled with patrolling trails, helping lost hikers, and observing wildlife. But that summer, everything changed. It was a crisp morning in late June when it all began. I was at the ranger station, sipping my coffee and catching up with my colleague Mitch Hawkins. Mitch had just returned from a 2-week vacation in the Rockies, and we were swapping stories when our radios crackled to life. A group of hikers had stumbled upon an abandoned campsite deep in the forest well off the marked trails. Finding deserted campsites wasn't uncommon, but something about this report made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Mitch and I loaded up our gear and headed out in our trusty Jeep. The drive along the winding dirt roads was familiar, the dense canopy of oak and hickory trees creating a tunnel of green above us. We parked at the Cedar Creek trailhead and began our hike. The forest was unusually quiet that day, with only the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird call breaking the silence. After about an hour of hiking, we reached the reported site. What we found made my stomach churn. The campsite looked like it had been hit by a tornado. A tent lay collapsed and torn. Its contents spilled across the forest floor. Food containers were strewn about, some half-eaten and others unopened. Personal belongings, clothes, books, a camera, were scattered in a wide radius around the central area. "Jesus," Mitch muttered. crouching down to examine a backpack. "Wallet's still here, Frank. Who leaves without their wallet?" I scanned the area, a sense of unease growing in the pit of my stomach. "Someone in a big hurry," I replied. "Let's check the immediate surroundings. They might still be nearby." We split up, keeping within shouting distance of each other. I moved towards the edge of the clearing where the trees grew denser and the shadows deeper. There was a palpable sense of being watched, but I tried to chalk it up to nerves. After about 20 minutes of searching, Mitch called out, "Frank, found something." I made my way over to where he stood, holding up a hiking boot. It was caked in mud and looked like it had been violently torn off someone's foot. "Christ," I breathed. "Maybe they got injured." Mitch nodded grimly. "We should call for a search team. This doesn't look good." We radioed in our findings and headed back to the Jeep, the forest seeming to close in around us as we walked. That night, a full search and rescue team combed the area, but found nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle, nothing to explain the hasty departure. The next few days were a blur of paperwork and follow-up investigations. The campers were identified as the Johnsons, a family of 4 from Little Rock who had been reported missing by relatives when they failed to return from their trip. Despite our best efforts, we couldn't find any trace of them beyond that abandoned campsite. A week later, we received another disturbing call. This time it was from a couple who had been camping near the same area. They reported strange noises at night, and more alarmingly, finding their campsite ransacked in the morning. The husband mentioned seeing a dark figure watching them from the tree line just before dawn. Mitch and I geared up once again, this time carrying our service firearms and extra supplies. As we hiked towards the couple's campsite, the forest felt different. The usual chorus of birds and insects was absent, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press in on us from all sides. We reached the site in the late afternoon. Like the first one, it was a scene of chaos. Gear strewn about, food containers ripped open, a palpable sense of panic lingering in the air. We decided to set up a temporary base and stay the night, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever had spooked the couple. Night fell, and the forest grew impossibly dark. Mitch and I took turns keeping watch, but nothing happened until just after midnight. I was on duty when I heard it, a rustling in the underbrush, followed by a low guttural sound that was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. "Mitch," I whispered, shaking him awake. "You hear that?" He was instantly alert, grabbing his flashlight and gun. The rustling grew louder, coming from the direction of the densest part of the forest. We moved closer, our lights trained on the source of the noise. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with a gaunt frame and skin that looked almost translucent in the beam of our flashlights. Its eyes reflected the light with an unnatural silvery sheen. "What the hell is that?" Mitch muttered, raising his gun. Before I could respond, the creature lunged at us with inhuman speed. Mitch fired, but it barely seemed to notice the impact. It knocked him to the ground, clawing at him with long, bony fingers. I raised my gun and fired twice, the shots echoing through the silent forest. The creature let out a high-pitched wail that sent shivers down my spine. It released Mitch and fled back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. Mitch was shaken, but mostly unharmed, save for some scratches and bruises. We decided to abandon the campsite immediately and head back to the station. As we hiked, we kept our guns ready, eyes constantly scanning the forest for any sign of the creature's return. Back at the station, we reported the encounter, but our supervisor, Dave, was skeptical. "You sure you didn't just see a bear?" he asked, though his tone suggested he knew as well as we did that no bear moved like that or looked so unnatural. "It wasn't a bear, Dave," Mitch insisted. "This was something else, something I've never seen before." The next few weeks were tense. We increased patrols in the area, but the creature didn't reappear. Slowly, the forest seemed to return to normal, the usual sounds of wildlife filling the air once more. But the memory of that night stayed with us, a lingering sense of unease that we couldn't shake. Then, about a month after our encounter, another report came in. A young couple, Kevin and Sarah Matthews, had gone missing while hiking in the eastern part of the forest. Their car was found parked at the Sunset Trail trailhead, but there was no sign of them beyond that. We organized a search party, combing the forest for any clues. We found their campsite on the second day of the search. It was abandoned like the others, with signs of a hasty departure, but no indication of where they might have gone. It was as if the forest had swallowed them up, leaving no trace. Mitch and I continued our patrols, but the sense of dread grew stronger with each passing day. We were no longer just park rangers. We were men haunted by the unknown, by a creature that defied explanation. Then, one evening as the sun was setting, we received a call from the station. A local hunter, Jim Parsons, had reported seeing a strange creature near Black Fork Mountain, not far from where the Matthews had gone missing. We grabbed our gear and headed out, determined to put an end to this nightmare. The drive was silent, both of us lost in our thoughts. We reached the area just as darkness fell, the forest cloaked in deep shadows. We moved cautiously, our flashlights sweeping across the trees and underbrush. Jim had marked the spot where he'd seen the creature on his GPS, and we made our way there, every sense on high alert. Suddenly we heard it, that same low guttural sound that had haunted my dreams for weeks. We turned our lights in the direction of the noise, and there it was, standing at the edge of a small clearing, watching us with those eerie glowing eyes. "Spread out," I whispered to Mitch. "We need to corner it." We moved slowly, trying to flank the creature. It stood unnaturally still, almost as if it was waiting for us. Then, with a burst of speed that seemed impossible for its gangly frame, it charged at Mitch. He fired, but the creature was too quick. It knocked him down, its claws slashing at his chest. I raised my gun and fired 3 times in rapid succession, hitting it square in the torso. The creature let out a piercing scream and fell to the ground, its body twitching and convulsing. I rushed to Mitch's side. He was bleeding from several deep gashes, but he was alive. We radioed for help and waited, keeping our guns trained on the creature's body. It didn't move, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly dead, just waiting. Help arrived within the hour, and we were taken back to the station. Mitch was patched up and sent to the hospital for further treatment. I gave my report, describing the creature in as much detail as I could. The creature's body was taken away for examination, but I never heard what became of it. It was as if the whole incident was swept under the rug, filed away in some dusty cabinet labeled unexplained. In the weeks that followed, the forest seemed to return to normal. Hikers and campers returned, unaware of the terror that had stalked these woods. But I knew better. There was something out there, something that didn't belong in our world. I continued my work as a park ranger, but I was always on edge, always watching. Mitch eventually left the job, unable to shake the fear that had taken root that night. I understood, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. This forest was my home, and I felt a responsibility to protect it and the people who came to enjoy its beauty. Years have passed since that summer, and the memory of the creature has faded for most. But not for me. Every now and then, I catch a glimpse of something in the shadows, a flicker of movement that sends my heart racing. I know it's still out there, waiting, watching, and I know that one day it will return. The Ozark National Forest changed me, made me wary, always on guard. But it's also my home, and I will do whatever it takes to keep it safe, even if it means facing that creature again. Because some things can't be explained, can't be understood. They just are, and all we can do is be ready when they come for us. As I sit here in my cabin watching the sun set over the mountains, I can't help but wonder what else might be hiding in the depths of these ancient forests. What other secrets does this land hold? I may never know the full truth of what happened that summer, but I do know this. The world is stranger and more mysterious than we can imagine, and sometimes the best we can do is stand our ground and face the unknown with courage and determination. So if you ever find yourself hiking through the Ozark National Forest and you feel a chill run down your spine, or hear a strange noise in the distance, remember my story, and remember that not all that wanders in the woods is lost. Some things are right where they want to be, waiting for the unwary to stumble into their domain. Stay safe out there and keep your eyes open. You never know what might be watching from the shadows.